Well, there's somebody right now who caught a glimpse of your presence and didn't know what to do with themselves. I'm telling you, the moment their eyes landed on you, something inside them paused. Not fear, not panic, just a quiet internal buckle, like their usual rhythm missed a beat and couldn't immediately find it again. You felt it, didn't you? Not as a rush, not as excitement. Just a subtle awareness that the room shifted the instant you entered it. You didn't announce yourself. You didn't project anything. You didn't try to be seen. You were simply there. And for someone who's used to reading situations through noise, through performance, through surface, level confidence, that kind of grounded presence is disorienting. They weren't shaken because you were intense. They were shaken because you were steady. See, most people carry themselves like they're constantly adjusting their tone, their posture, their opinions, trying to match the temperature of whoever's in front of them. You didn't adjust. You didn't mirror them. You didn't rush to fit the moment. And that refusal to bend immediately told them something they weren't ready to hear about themselves. You didn't look at them like you were sizing them up. You didn't look away either. You looked present, fully here. And that's when their internal dialogues started scrambling. Because people who rely on masks panic when they realize the mask isn't being acknowledged. They expected curiosity or intimidation or indifference. What they got instead was neutrality, clean, unreactive awareness. And neutrality is confronting when someone is used to controlling how they're perceived. You weren't trying to make an impression, but you made one anyway. Not because of what you said or did, but because of what you didn't do. You didn't rush to explain yourself. You didn't fill silence. You didn't soften your presence to make them comfortable. You let the moment breathe. And that's where it happened. That internal pause they felt wasn't about you. It was about the gap between who they present as and who they actually are. Your presence highlighted that gap without pointing at it. You became a mirror without trying to be one. Some people experience that as inspiration. Others experience it as discomfort. Both reactions come from the same place. Self-awareness being triggered unexpectedly. They walked away replaying the moment. Not your words, your stillness, your pacing. The way you didn't seem pulled by the room. They asked themselves questions they didn't mean to ask. Why didn't that person need approval? Why didn't they react when I expected them to? Why did I feel like I was being seen without being judged? You didn't expose them, you didn't challenge them. You didn't confront anything. You simply existed without distortion. And that's enough to unsettle anyone who's been operating on performance for too long. Here's the part they don't understand yet. You didn't cultivate this presence deliberately. You didn't wake up one day and decide to be composed. This steadiness was built slowly, quietly, through lived experience, through moments where reacting would have been easier, but you chose restraint, through times when noise tempted you, but you stayed anchored, through situations where proving yourself was an option and you declined it. So when they encountered you, they weren't meeting confidence, they were meeting coherence. And coherence doesn't argue, it doesn't announce itself, it doesn't compete, it just is. And when it enters a space, everything else has to recalibrate around it. That's why they felt thrown off, because their usual tools didn't work. Charm didn't land, intensity didn't move you, posturing didn't impress you. You weren't cold, you weren't distant. You were simply unavailable to manipulation, and people can feel that instantly. You didn't need to dominate the interaction to lead it. You didn't need volume to hold gravity. Your calm carried weight because it wasn't performative. It wasn't strategic. It was natural. They sensed it on a level they couldn't articulate. That's why they left the interaction quieter than they arrived. That's why they thought about you later without knowing why. That's why your presence lingered longer than the conversation itself. You didn't take anything from them, but something in them shifted, and you moved on without replaying it, without needing confirmation, without wondering how you came across, because your sense of self isn't outsourced. It doesn't depend on reflection. It's internally sourced. That's the difference. People who live externally experience your presence as disruption. People who are grounded experience it as clarity. And you don't control which reaction someone has. You don't try to, you let it happen. You don't chase impact. Impact follows alignment. That's why this keeps repeating. Different faces, different rooms, same moment, same internal pause on the other side, same quiet recalibration you never asked for and never needed to acknowledge. And this is only the beginning of that pattern revealing itself more clearly, not louder, not bigger, just more consistently, more unmistakably, more undeniable. You don't need to do anything differently. You already are what unsettles the false and steadies the real. And the ones who felt that shift first. They're still trying to understand why a single moment of your presence lingered longer than anything you said. They'll keep replaying it. You won't, because you were never performing. You were simply being. And the more they replay it, the clearer something becomes for them, even if they don't have the language for it yet. You didn't enter their space carrying urgency. You didn't scan the room looking for leverage. You didn't adjust your posture to command attention. You didn't try to read them before they read you. You were already settled, and that settled quality is rare in a world addicted to motion. Most people move as if they're being chased by something invisible. Approval, control, relevance. You weren't running. You weren't hiding either. You were standing exactly where you were, internally and externally, and that alone disrupted the rhythm they depend on to feel safe. They're used to interactions being transactional. Someone wants something, someone needs something, someone is trying to extract value. When they couldn't locate your angle, their mind kept circling the moment, looking for it. Was it confidence? Was it detachment? Was it indifference? None of those fit. Because what they felt wasn't distance, it was completeness. You weren't withholding. You simply weren't reaching. That's when people start projecting. They begin assigning meaning where there is only some decide you're intimidating, some decide you're mysterious, some decide you're arrogant, some decide you're wise. All of it says more about them than it ever will about you. Because when someone is internally steady, others are forced to fill the silence with their own assumptions. You noticed it too, the way their speech subtly shifted, how their sentences lost momentum, how their usual confidence came out, a little rehearsed, a little brittle. You didn't cause that. You didn't intend it. You just didn't participate in the dance they expected. And dances fall apart when one person stops moving to the beat. You didn't interrogate them. You didn't challenge their stories. You listened without leaning in, without pulling away. And that kind of listening is unsettling. Because it doesn't reward exaggeration. It doesn't validate performance. It waits. And waiting exposes what's real. That's why they felt seen without being studied. You weren't analyzing them, but their nervous system reacted as if you were, because deep down they recognized something familiar in you, a version of themselves that once existed before they learned to perform. That recognition is uncomfortable. Most people spend their lives reinforcing the identity they've built to survive. When they encounter someone who doesn't seem to need those defenses, it destabilizes the story they tell themselves about why those defenses are necessary. You didn't threaten their status. You didn't challenge their intelligence. You didn't question their authority. But your presence quietly questioned their dependence on those things. And that's why the moment lingered. They tried to shake it off, told themselves it was nothing, just a look, just a vibe, just a coincidence. But later, in quieter moments, it resurfaced in the gap between thoughts, in the pause before responding to someone else, in the realization that they were speaking more carefully than usual. You became a reference point without trying to be one, and you moved on. That's the part they don't expect, that you don't hold on to these moments. You don't collect reactions as proof of anything. You don't need to revisit the interaction to extract meaning, because you weren't feeding on it. You were simply present within it. People who rely on external validation always revisit moments. They replay them to measure impact. You don't do that. Your sense of self doesn't fluctuate with response. That stability didn't come from isolation. It came from discernment, from learning when engagement enriches and when it drains, from choosing depth over volume, from realizing that not every moment requires a response. So when someone encounters you and feels that internal pause, it's not because you've mastered control over others. It's because you've mastered restraint within yourself. And restraint is magnetic, not in a dramatic way. In a quiet, gravitational way, it pulls attention inward. It slows things down. It forces recalibration. People either rise to meet that level of awareness, or they feel exposed by it. You don't judge either outcome. You've learned that reactions are information, not responsibility. You let people process what they need to process. You don't rush them to clarity. You don't explain yourself to make them comfortable. You trust the moment to do its work. That trust is felt. It's why conversations with you don't escalate, why conflicts soften, why tension dissipates faster than expected. Not because you intervene, but because you don't amplify what doesn't need amplification. You don't add fuel, you don't absorb heat. You remain regulated, and regulation is contagious in the same way chaos is. The difference is, regulation spreads quietly. They noticed how you didn't fill space with opinions, how you didn't rush to agree or disagree, how you allowed complexity without needing to resolve it immediately. That patience unsettled them more than confrontation ever could. Because confrontation gives people something to push against. Presence gives them nothing but themselves. You became the moment where their usual tactics fell flat, not because you rejected them, but because you didn't respond to them at all. You responded to what was real underneath, and sometimes that response was simply silence. Silence, when it's grounded, isn't empty. It's full of awareness, full of choice, full of restraint. That's what they felt, and it forced a question they weren't ready to ask out loud. Why does this person seem intact regardless of outcome? Why do they seem unaffected by what usually moves everyone else? They might never articulate it, but the question stays with them. Meanwhile, your life continues unchanged. You don't adjust your pace. You don't capitalize on the moment. You don't seek to reproduce the effect, because you know it wasn't an effect to begin with. It was alignment. Alignment doesn't require maintenance. It requires honesty. And you've already done that work. That's why these encounters feel inevitable rather than exciting. Familiar rather than surprising. You've seen this pattern before. Different faces, same internal response, same pause, same recalibration. You don't romanticize it. You don't weaponize it. You simply recognize it. And as this pattern continues, something else begins to shift. People who encounter you start interacting differently with others too. They become slightly more aware, slightly less reactive, slightly more discerning. Not because you told them to be, but because the encounter lingered like a quiet lesson. You didn't teach anything, you modeled something. And modeling reaches places instruction never will. This isn't about influence. It's about coherence. Influence fades when attention shifts. Coherence remains even when no one is watching. You've learned to live from that place, to trust that being grounded is enough. that presence doesn't need amplification, that clarity doesn't need defense, and as long as you remain there, these moments will keep unfolding, not louder, not more dramatic, just more refined, more precise, more unmistakable, and you'll keep moving through them the same way you always have. Calm, observant, unattached. Because you were never trying to be felt, you simply are. And the rest will continue to adjust around that, whether they understand it yet or not. And by the time the echo of that encounter finally settles, something subtle but permanent has shifted. Not in you, in them. You go on with your day, exactly as before, same pace, same inner steadiness, same refusal to inflate a moment into an identity. You don't replay the interaction. You don't assign it, meaning you don't wonder how you were perceived. Because you weren't performing, there's nothing to review. But they carry it. They carry the quiet disruption of realizing that presence doesn't announce itself, that strength doesn't posture, that clarity doesn't argue. They felt what it's like to be in the same space as someone who isn't negotiating their worth in real time. That realization lingers longer than discomfort ever could. At first, they try to rationalize it. They label it chemistry, confidence, coincidence, anything that keeps it external, anything that prevents them from looking inward. But the truth doesn't need agreement to exist. It waits, patient, precise, and, eventually, it catches up. They start noticing the gap between how they present themselves and how they feel. The difference between what they say and what they mean. The effort it takes to maintain the version of themselves they've been defending for years. And that's where the reckoning really happens. Not because you forced it, not because you exposed them, but because your presence removed the noise long enough for them to hear themselves clearly. You didn't make them uncomfortable. You made them aware. Awareness doesn't shout. It doesn't accuse. It simply illuminates. And once something is illuminated, it can't go back to being unseen. Some people will respond to that by growing quieter, more grounded, more honest. Others will respond by avoiding you altogether, not out of fear, but out of resistance. Both reactions are valid, both confirm the same thing: the moment mattered. And still, you don't carry it. You've learned that your role is not to manage how others process truth. Your role is to remain truthful to yourself. First, to the moment. Second, to nothing else. That's why your presence doesn't escalate situations. It stabilizes them. That's why people don't feel judged around you. They feel measured, not by you, but by their own internal standards suddenly coming back online. You don't chase recognition because you understand something most people don't realize until much later. Recognition that has to be chased isn't recognition at all. It's negotiation. You don't negotiate who you are. So when someone encounters you and feels that internal pause, that hesitation, that recalibration, it's not because you're doing something extraordinary. It's because you're doing something rare. You're being congruent. Your inner world and outer behavior match. Your words and silence align. Your reactions are proportionate. Your boundaries are intact. Your attention is deliberate. Your nervous system isn't outsourcing regulation to the environment. That coherence is felt immediately. It doesn't intimidate. It doesn't dominate. It doesn't demand. It simply stands, and standing still in a world obsessed with motion feels radical. That's why the impact lingers even after you're gone. You don't leave people with questions about you. You leave them with questions about themselves, and those questions don't fade quickly. They resurface in moments of choice, in moments of reaction, in moments where they're tempted to perform instead of respond. You become a quiet reference point, not a standard to reach, but a reminder of what's possible when someone stops fragmenting themselves for acceptance. And you never ask for credit because you know the truth doesn't need a spokesperson. It needs time. Time to contrast noise with consistency. Time to let exaggeration collapse under its own weight. Time to let behavior speak louder than interpret. Time to let reality correct itself without force. You trust that process because you've seen it work over and over again. So you continue moving through the world the same way. Grounded, attentive, unrushed. You don't shrink to make others comfortable. You don't expand to make yourself impressive. You remain exact, and that exactness is enough to interrupt patterns, enough to soften chaos, enough to invite honesty, enough to unsettle what isn't aligned. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just inevitably, you don't need to be understood by everyone. You don't need to be liked by everyone. You don't need to be followed or praised or explained. You only need to be real, and you already are. So let the moment pass. Let the echo do its work. Let people sit with what they felt in your presence and decide in their own time what to do with it. You'll be exactly where you've always been. Centered, clear, unmoved, not because nothing affects you, but because you no longer confuse reaction with truth. And that, quietly, is what makes all the difference.